Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Welcome everyone. After a brief hiatus, last week it was raining so hard, very unusual storm in Los Angeles, so we skipped last Friday. So here we are again. Last class, meaning 2 weeks ago, we came up to shloka 61 of chapter 2. And as usual, we're working off the app. And up to 61, right? And so let me just summarize briefly 61 before we move on to the next shlokas. 61. Tani sarvani sanyamya yukta asita matparaha. Vashehi yasindriyani tasya pragya pratishtita. The key phrase here, okay, the general gist is that person who has fully controlled his or her senses and matparaha. What does matparaha mean, either of you? Mat means Bhagavan Krishna is talking, so he's referring to himself. Paraham means intent on, concentrated on. It's just a tiny phrase, but extremely important. Why is it important? No, opposite.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mentioned in the previous class that Shankara's interpretation of mat, well, before I get into Shankara's interpretation, but why it's so important is this is the first mention of bhakti in the Bhagavad Gita. Before that, up to shloka 60, you don't find any bhakti. Zero. Even though ultimately the scripture is all about bhakti and it culminates in bhakti, and the keynote of the scripture arguably is bhakti. But this is the very first slight mention, matparaha. This person should not just have his senses under control. That person should also be matparaha, thinking of me at all times. So that's why this is extremely significant. It's even more significant for bhakti schools of Vedanta, such as Ramanuja. And remember, Ramanuja, he has a really brilliant insight here. And he says, see, up to shloka 60, the spiritual aspirant faces a kind of paradox. The paradox is, do either of you remember this paradox? It has to do with sense control. No, it's been a while. You cannot attain spiritual illumination without controlling your senses. At the same time, Bhagavan Krishna says in shloka 59 that you cannot fully conquer the senses until you have attained spiritual illumination. So it seems like a vicious cycle. Ramanuja says, how do you break this vicious cycle? Shloka 61 tells us how to break it. How do you break it? Matparaha. Anytime you just try to control your senses using just your own self-effort is doomed to fail. You'll be trapped in this vicious cycle. You'll never be able to escape. That's why matparaha. You control the senses. Use your self-effort while depending on God at the same time, while thinking of God at the same time. Only through that means can you break out of this vicious cycle. How does Ramanuja explain the logic of bhakti? How does it help us to escape from this vicious cycle? When you are matparaha, when you're contemplating God, while also trying to control the senses, what happens? You purify your mind. Ramanuja says, chitta shuddhi. Through chitta shuddhi, what happens? You're able to better control the senses. It's only with the pure mind that you can really control the senses. And it's through sense control that you can ultimately attain spiritual illumination. Voila, vicious circle is broken. Okay, so that's a brief summary. And the other thing is, remember this ongoing question of Sridhara is the one of the few commentators who takes Arjuna's question literally and thinks that Krishna's answer is also literal in some sense. And so he takes this verse, this asita, to explain how the sthita pragya, the illumined soul, sits. Okay, and so that means there's one left, which we'll get to just to anticipate. well, we'll get to it. It'll come. There's the fourth one is, how does that person walk? That should be coming up. Okay. So now let's come to 62 and 63. They're actually of a piece, these two shlokas. So as always, I'll recite one pada at a time, and you please repeat. 2.62. Dhyayato Vishayan Pumsaha Sangasteshu Upajayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamaha Kamat Krodho Bhijayate. Okay, and let's read the next one as well, because they go together. Krodhad Bhavati Sammoha Sammohad Smriti Vibhramaha Smriti Bhramshad Buddhi Nasho Buddhi Nashad Pranashyati. Very good. Now, why is there no, I just want to make sure it's recording. How do I know whether this is recording? Is there a way to know this? Oh, it says recording. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Oh yeah, now I get it. Okay. So now, these two shlokas are full of psychological insight. Very profound, very relevant to contemporary neuroscience, contemporary psychology. It elaborates, 62 and 63 elaborate an 8-link psychological causal chain resulting in our spiritual death. It's not the happiest. Okay, but very, very important for our spiritual life. So let's go through it fairly carefully. Let's look at the Anvaya for 62 first. Vishayan, meaning sense objects, dhyayataha, pumsaha. Dhyayata means thinking of, dwelling on with the mind. Dwelling on sense object with the mind, the pumsaha, the person who does this. Teshu sangaha upajayate. One develops a sangha. What is sangha? Attachment. Emotional attachment. Or even physical attachment. Toward those, teshu, sense objects. Very logical. First step in the causal chain. First step is you dwell on sense objects. What results? Attachment. And now next, notice the, okay, so sangas teshu pajayate. Okay, so, sorry, let's look at the Anvaya again. Sangat kamaha sanjayate. So these words like sangat, does anyone know Sanskrit here or some basics? So which vibhakti is sangat? Yeah, panchami vibhakti, which means from, the ablative case. So that's used again and again here. Sangat, kamat, krodhat, sammohat, smriti bhramshat, buddhi nashat. So that's the idea of this 8-link causal chain. A leads to B, B leads to C. From A comes B, from B comes C. That's why Panchami Vibhakti, it's the 5th case, which means from. So, Sangat Kamaha Sanjayate means from attachment comes what? Kama, desire. Kama, Kamat, again, 5th case, Panchami Vibhakti, from Kama, from desire, desire for the sense objects. Krodha Abhijayate. What does Krodha mean? Anger, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we'll talk about why. Okay, there's something coming up here on WhatsApp. Maybe we can disable this person's WhatsApp, Charit's, because otherwise it may disturb us. I think is that or messages or something is. Okay, anyway, let it be. Hopefully nobody won't be too crazy. Okay. Now, this is one of those words. Krodha, you're correct. It does mean anger, literally. But Well, let's talk about it right now, actually. Okay, before we get there, Krodha we'll talk about, but before we get there, how is 62 related to the previous shlokas? Because up till now, Bhagavan Krishna has been explaining to Arjuna the characteristics of an illumined soul, a sthita prajna, somebody with established wisdom, right? A firm intelligence. But now suddenly it seems like this is how is this not a non sequitur?
It's like an opposite of what you need to do.
Yeah, so exactly, it almost seems like the opposite, right? Ramanuja has a very interesting insight here. He says that these shlokas, 62 and 63, are a kind of cautionary tale. And he says it follows directly from 61. And here again, I see Ramanuja's interpretive genius. It's very, not that it's, that everybody has to agree with it, but I just think it's very intelligent and interesting. He says, let's go back to matparaha, that important phrase, matparaha in the previous shloka. How do you break out of the vicious cycle? By thinking of God. Now what he says is 62 and 63 are a cautionary tale if you don't depend on God. If you are not matpara, if you are trying to control the senses only based on your own self-effort without having any bhakti, then what results? This 8-link causal chain resulting in spiritual disaster. So it's very interesting. Now we get to this important word krodha. So first of all, see, let's think about the logic of this causal chain first. Dhyayataha vishan pumsaha sangasteshu pujayate. Seems very logical. The more you dwell on something, the more attached you become to whatever it is. If you're thinking of cigarettes and you're addicted to cigarettes, what happens? The more you think about it, the more desirous you become, the more attached you are to cigarettes. Same thing with even people. If you're very attached to a person, the more you think of that person, the more attached you become. Very logical, right? Any questions about that first link? Next, from attachment comes desire. What is the difference between attachment and desire?
Take action towards that desire. Maybe.
That's interesting. As opposed to attachment where it's maybe more mental and it doesn't necessarily translate into action. That's a very interesting, I'm not saying there's a right answer to this. I'm actually
want to own it.
Which is similar to maybe desire for possession. You find that in kama, whereas with attachment, it's not quite as strong or something, or what? Or how would you?
I think it's not tied to you yet.
It's not tied to you yet.
Once you have a desire, you want it.
Okay.
yourself.
Okay. So Ramanuja's take on this is he raises this question: what is the connection? What is the relationship between attachment, sangha, and kama, desire? He says, kama nama sangasya vipakadasha. Which means kama is just the further developed state of attachment, which I think both of you are kind of saying in different ways. If you keep reinforcing that attachment, what happens? It transforms into or grows into full-blown kama, desire, where you cannot but pounce on that object, basically. Now we get to link number 4. Kamat krodho vijayate. Each of the previous ones are very logical in a way. Kamat krodho vijayate. Can you explain this? Why should anger result from desire? Let's talk about this for some time.
Non-fulfillment of desire leads to anger.
Okay, so say I have an intense desire for a rasgulla. How does that desire for rasgulla result in anger?
I think if you don't get it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is one interpretation. This is the interpretation of Shankara, for instance. This is the interpretation of Ramanuja also, I believe. They take krodha literally to mean just anger. And they say this is very logical. So long as you don't get the object of desire. The limitation of that interpretation is, then it becomes a little bit narrow. Because what if you do get the object of desire? That seems to be missing from this. I've always thought, the first time I read this, I thought this is brilliant, the 8-link chain, except that this part, I feel like it's a little bit, leaves something to be desired. It leaves out, well, because people will say, well, but I'm getting the object of desire, so then I'm happy, so everything is great. No. So Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting take on this. So this is one of the few places where the app actually has the appropriate commentary, or for the most part. So let's you'd have to go to the next, like 63, because the commentary is really applying to both. Actually, yeah, okay, we'll read part of it for now. So please go to the commentary of 2.63. Okay, and unfortunately, because it's taken from a book, it kind of starts in the middle of the thought. That is because the mind naturally lends itself to the senses. Okay, the mind naturally lends itself to the senses. The mind is sense-oriented. It observes the objects of sense with an inner interest, dhyayato vishan pumsa, settles upon them and makes them the object of absorbing thought for the intelligence and of strong interest for the will. See, notice this connection. Both of you are saying that it's when Sangha matures into Kama, what's added is not just a thought in the mind, but it's somehow connected with will. You want to do something about your attachment. You want to grab that object, gain that object of desire. So that's what Sri Aurobindo is also saying. By that attachment comes, by dwelling on those sense objects, attachment comes. By attachment, desire. Now notice, next, how does he explain this fourth link? By desire, distress, passion, and anger when the desire is not satisfied, or is thwarted, or opposed. Okay, let's pause there, because then he goes on to explain 63, okay? So see how he's glossing this term krodha in a broader way. He has anger there, but he has two other words. Yeah, more like rajas actually, yeah. Distress and passion. Passion especially is a very direct translation of rajas almost. And the nice thing I find about this translation of krodha is that it is not as narrow as just taking it as anger. It can accommodate both the possibilities. So let's think of, because some of you are computer scientists, so you do this if then, right? So if this, then that. Okay, so one scenario is the object of desire is not available. What results? Anger. Krodha in the sense of anger. But what if the object of desire is available? And of course, so if it's anger, then we'll see what happens next. But in any case, what about scenario 2? What if the object of desire is available? Yeah, the thing is, that's the interesting thing. That's why Sri Aurobindo, when he says distress and passion, this is in every movie. If you get the object of desire, what happens? You inevitably become full of distress and passion. Why? Because na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati. You can never achieve satisfaction of enjoyments through. You can never achieve satisfaction through na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati. You can never satisfy your desires through sense enjoyments. Even though the illusion, one of the greatest illusions in the world is that everybody thinks that if I only get this thing, then I'll be happy. But in reality, that never happens. What happens? Havisha Krishnavatmeva bhuye eva vivadite. I'm quoting a famous verse from Bhagavad Purana. What is that? What does that second line mean?
Adding ghee to it.
It's like adding ghee to the fire, clarified butter to the fire. The more you indulge a desire, the more intense that desire becomes. What does that lead to? Distress and passion. So the beauty of Sri Aurobindo's translation of krodha is that it encompasses both scenarios. If the object of desire is available and if the object of desire is not available. So that solved this quandary, this difficulty I had for many years, actually. When I first read the Gita at age 19, I said, everything is wonderful about this except this krodha. Sri Aurobindo nicely handles that. Now, so let's see how this dramatic story continues, ultimately resulting in our ruin. Krodhad. Oh, we already recited this, is that right? Okay, so now let's do the Anvaya for 2.63. Krodhad sammoha bhavati. Let's take Sri Aurobindo's translation, just because, as we discussed, I think that it's a better translation because it's broader. And in fact, notice how, we'll get to it, okay? But he basically translates the second occurrence of krodha. So krodha, the first word of 63, as just passion. From passion comes what? Sammoha. What does sammoha mean? Delusion is the usual translation, delusion. Sammohat smriti vibhramaha. From delusion comes what? Smriti vibhramaha. Loss of memory. But then there's another interesting question, and there's a lot of debate about this. What exactly, memory of what? The memory of what is lost as a result of delusion? This is another interesting question. We'll get to that soon. But let me just finish. So that's link 6. Smriti bhramshad buddhinashaha. From the loss of memory comes buddhinasha. Total destruction of buddhi. There, almost everybody agrees, the commentators agree, buddhi here means discriminative intelligence and will. What you should do, what you should not do, what is permanent, what is impermanent. Final link in the chain, 8th link, buddhinashat pranashyati. From the destruction of buddhi comes death, literally. But most commentators take this to mean spiritual death. One thing I was thinking is sometimes you find in the news that there are these super famous multimillionaire, billionaire celebrities who die of drug overdoses. And that could be a case of a kind of literal pranashyati. But anyway, so that sometimes happens too, you know, people dropping dead in the bathroom from some heroin overdose or something like that. But most of the time, if it's not a physical death, it's at least a spiritual death. Okay, but let's come back to this interesting question of, okay, let's first read Sri Aurobindo's, the remainder of Sri Aurobindo's commentary, because we stopped in the middle. So, by desire, distress, passion, and anger, when the desire is not satisfied or is thwarted or opposed, and by passion, the soul is obscured. See, by passion, the soul is obscured. Now he's translating krodhat as by passion. And that it seems to be okay because it's broad, right? It's like you were saying that it's kind of like rajas, which encompasses anger, it encompasses desire, it encompasses distress, passion, right? Krodhat bhavati sammoha. By passion, the soul is obscured. This is kind of interesting. He's interpreting this sammoha as a delusion about our true nature. And we lose sight of the fact that we're actually eternal souls, separate from the body-mind complex. So that's one interpretation. But others, for instance, both Shankara and Ramanuja, and sometimes there are rare cases where Shankara and Ramanuja agree with each other, and this is one of them. They say that sammoha means loss of viveka. You lose your sense of discrimination between what ought to be done and what ought not to be done. So regarding kritya and akritya, kritya means what ought to be done, what you ought to do. Akritya means what you ought not to do. You lose that discrimination. Sammohat smriti vibhramaha. Here is, so now let's continue with Sri Aurobindo's. The intelligence and will forget to see and be seated in the calm observing soul. He's still explaining that 5th link, sammoha. Next, 6th link. There is a fall from the memory of one's true self. Let me repeat that. There is a fall from the memory of one's true self. And by that lapse, the intelligent will is also obscured, destroyed even. Buddhinasho. So here we get 7th link. Smriti bhramshad buddhinasho. Destruction of buddhi. He's taking that buddhi to mean lapse or death of destruction of the intelligent will. For the time being, it no longer exists to our memory of ourselves. It disappears in a cloud of passion. We become passion, wrath, grief, and cease to be self and intelligence and will. This then must be prevented, and all the senses brought utterly under control. For only by an absolute control of the senses can the wise and calm intelligence be firmly established in its proper seat. So now let's go back to the 6th link in this chain. Sammohat smriti vibhramaha. Smriti vibhramaha, what is the object? What is the memory of what that's being lost as a result of delusion? Sri Aurobindo says memory of one's true eternal self. Ramanuja has an interesting interpretation. He says that what's lost is memory of our own prior efforts at self-control. As spiritual aspirants, we're always in, it's because of our past actions that we're now spiritual aspirants. But in that moment of delusion, what happens is we forget about all those prior efforts. And as a result, we act in a very unwholesome way. Shankara, meanwhile, interprets this as loss of memory of the scriptures, scriptural teachings, like the teachings of the Upanishads, teachings of the Bhagavad Gita itself, and loss of memory of your guru's teachings and your love for your guru, and your obligations to your guru. Now, this is another case where I feel, because it genuinely is ambiguous. Smriti Vibhramaha, how do we know what loss of memory of what? And it seems to me that none of these interpretations, so far we've talked about 3 different interpretations. Sri Aurobindo says loss of memory of one's true self. Ramanuja says the loss of memory of our own prior efforts at self-control. Shankara says loss of memory of the teachings of scripture and the teachings of the guru. These are not necessarily contradictory. I see them as complementary, right? But losing memory of spiritually beneficial things, whether they're in the form of scriptural teachings or your guru's teachings or your own true self or your own prior efforts in sadhana, whatever it is. So that's the 6th link. 7th link, Smriti Brahmashad Buddhi Nasho. Here, there's a slight issue of sort of, they're trying to avoid redundancy between sammoha and buddhi nasha. So sammoha, Ramanuja and Shankara have already explained that sammoha, delusion, means loss of viveka, loss of discrimination between what should be done and what should not be done. So now, some commentators will feel uneasy about translating this buddhi in the same way as viveka. But others, like Shankara, doesn't seem to be too bothered by this. And he interprets buddhi nasho as also loss of viveka. Maybe an even more kind of extreme form of loss of viveka. Maybe in that earlier stage, some moha, there's still some hope if you can pull in the reins, or, But at this stage, the 7th stage, it's almost too late. Buddhi nasho, it's almost completely destroyed. It's a kind of more extreme form of loss of discrimination. And finally, we get to 8. Buddhi nashat pranashyati. What results from the destruction of buddhi? Death. Shankara says, what does this death mean? Not a literal death, but a spiritual death. This person becomes unfit for liberation, unable to attain liberation. Swami Tapasyanandaji, he has an interesting interpretation of this death, this metaphorical death. He says that that person is reduced to the level of animality. Because what distinguishes the lower animals from human animals, from us, human beings, is that humans possess viveka, discrimination. We have higher goals in life than just eating, sleeping, drinking, right? And procreation. But if we, starting with, see how it might seem very innocent. You're dwelling on sense subjects. Almost everybody dwells on sense subjects. We're in Hollywood, or I live in Hollywood. So we're surrounded by people dwelling on sense subjects. But see how it results in spiritual ruin. Something as seemingly innocent as that. And Ramanuja has a different interpretation of pranashyati, this death. He says that the result of this 8-link psychological causal chain is the loss of our prior efforts to realize ourselves as spiritual souls. So we've made all this effort in the past to realize our true natures as eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. But if we go through this chain, what results is that all of that effort gets wasted. We have to start from 0 again. If we can, even then, if we're not completely hopeless. Okay, so this was a lot. So any questions about this before we move on. Yeah.
What's the seventh link again?
Seventh link is Smriti Bhramshad Buddhi Nasho. From the loss of memory results the destruction of buddhi, this discriminative intelligence. Sri Aurobindo translates buddhi as the intelligent will, but it's some combination of discrimination and willing, actually. As both of you pointed out also about kama, the idea is that you don't just have some intellectual attachment or mental attachment, you want to do something about it. You want to possess it. But in the same way, buddhi, true buddhi, is not just about understanding something, but it also translates into action and behavior. I think I talked about this last time, but there's an expression in Bangla called Gyan Papi. What does Gyan Papi mean? Gyana Papi.
You know what is right, but still you do that.
But you don't, you do the opposite. I think in Greek philosophy, it's called akrasia. Akrasia. And there's a big philosophical discussion about, is it even possible? Can you really know, huh? Yeah, exactly. So can you really know what is right and yet not do what is right? Or is it really a case of you don't fully know what's right? That's why it's a very interesting philosophical discussion. Socrates has these discussions. Plato talks about this and later philosophers. But in any case, this buddhi it should translate in action. So if you just talk big about, you shouldn't do this or you should do this, but you look at that person's life and you find, but that person's not actually practicing what he or she preaches. It means that person doesn't have true buddhi. And a Gyanapapi is somebody who knows fully well what ought to be done and yet does the opposite. He doesn't do it. So that's not true buddhi. That jnana is not true jnana. It's just a kind of means that the will is not strong enough to actually do what's right. Okay, any other questions before we move on? It's very interesting. This is very deep in psychological insights and very, and I think one could do really interesting research work on.
I think because you don't remember your past experience, your intellect cannot discriminate because there is no precedent.
Right, that's a nice point. Yeah, so for those of you online who didn't hear that, Prashant, right? You're saying that you're kind of going more deeply into this seventh link. Smriti Brahmshad Buddhi Nasho, you're saying.
Yeah, this is one interpretation I have heard.
Oh, I see. Who gives that interpretation?
Sadhguru Madhusudan Sai.
Sadhguru Madhusudan Sai. His interpretation is, according to Prashant here, that it's because of our memory of our prior efforts at spiritual practice, what we should avoid, what we should not avoid.
Even general past experience.
Past experience, right? Learning from experience, basically, that kind of idea. If we lose that memory, what happens? We lose that viveka because we grow through our experiences. Is that the basic idea?
Yeah, because intellect needs memory to function, right? That is the core.
Okay, yeah, I mean, to put it very simply, a 5-year-old, a mother will tell the boy, don't put your hand on the fire, on the stove. But you know what 5-year-olds are like. So he's going to put his hand on the fire. When does he finally learn? When he puts his hand on the fire and he gets burned. So that's a nice example, right, of this point you're making.
Right, that buddhi needs chitta, that's the core.
Right.
Of the mind.
Right. Okay. The antakarana is in these 4 parts. Okay. Thank you. That's a very interesting point. Okay. Any other questions?
Would be from loss of memory. Is the Smriti Brahmshad
Buddhi Nasho. Correct. Yep. Yep. Any other questions? So this is a kind of interlude, because then before those 62 and 63, you have the characteristics of the illumined soul. After 62 and 63, after 63, you get, again, Krishna comes back to characteristics of an illumined soul. So now let's look at 64. And here again, well, okay, for some reason the Anvaya, they packed it. They're doing the Anvaya of both 64 and 65. In this case, I don't think it's necessary. But in any case, let's recite 64. Ragadvesha Vimuktaistu Vishayan Indriyaishcharan Atmavashyair Vidhe Atma prasadam adhigacchati. Okay. Yeah, we'll look at the first part of the Anvaya, the first sentence of the Anvaya here. It's explaining this shloka. Vidheya Atma. Vidheya means controlled or restrained. Atma means self. Whenever you encounter the word self in these scriptures, whether it's Upanishads or Bhagavad Gita, there's always a question of which self is being referred to. It gets a little bit confusing. And different commentators will have different interpretations. Sometimes it can mean mind, sometimes lower self, sometimes higher self, sometimes highest self, supreme self. It's difficult to say sometimes. Okay, but if we're to take it, and we're going to talk about this more in a little bit, but just as a kind of rough gloss, Vidheya Atma means one who has restrained him or her self. The self-controlled person. Two, but Atma Vashyaihi Ragadvesha Vyuktaihi Indriyahi. With the senses, Indriyahi, and then there are these two long adjectives modifying Indriyahi, senses. What are these senses like? Ragadvesha Vyuktaihi. Totally devoid of raga and dvesha. Attraction and aversion. Desire and aversion. And Atma Vashyaihi. The senses themselves are under the control of the Atman. Again, we have Atman. So we have this word Atman coming twice in two phrases, almost back to back, Vidheya Atma and Atma Vashyaihi. And we're going to get to this, of how different commentators understand this Atma and the relationship between the Vidheya Atma, the self-controlled person, and the Indriyas, the senses, which are Atma Vashyaihi, which are under the control of the Atma. How are these two things related? It's very interesting. We'll get to that very soon. But Vishayan Charan. Vishayan means sense objects. Charan, sort of, okay, Sri Aurobindo has a very poetic way of translating Charan, ranging over. The senses are ranging over the sense objects. But why does this psychological chain, this 8-link chain, not get triggered? In this case, in the case of 64?
Because they are under control.
Exactly, because of these two adjectives. These are not ordinary senses. They are senses which are raga dvesha vyuktaihi, totally free of attraction and aversion. Because they're free of attraction and aversion, the psychological chain doesn't even get off the ground, because that attachment won't form. And because Atma Vashyaihi, because those senses are under the control of Atman, whatever that means. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, prasadam adhigacchati. Prasadam means peace, tranquility, shanti. Adhigacchati, attains. That person alone attains this spiritual peace. Now, let's, as I promised, let's look a little bit more deeply at this issue of what does Atman mean in these two phrases, Vidheya Atma and the Indriyas, which are Atma Vashya, under the control of the Atman. I find really interesting, I like the interpretation, the line of interpretation of Shankara here. Shankara, Sridhara, Anandagiri, these are all people in the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition. What they say is, this Vidheya Atma, this person who has controlled the self, here we should take self to mean the mind. The person who has full control over his or her own mind. And then they say, how do we explain Atma Vashyaihi Indriyaihi? The Indriyas are under the control of the mind. So Atman, they're taking as mind in both of these phrases. And why is this spiritually significant? Let's go back to Shat Sampat, the 6 treasures. What are the first 2 of the 6 treasures in spiritual life?
Shama, Dhamma.
Very good. Shama and Dhamma. Shama and Dhamma. Shama means control of the mind. Dhamma means what?
Control of senses.
Control of the senses. Restraint of the senses. And whenever you get these kinds of lists of qualities in an Indian context, often, I don't want to say whenever, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but there's often a significance to the ordering. Ashtanga Yoga and Patanjali, even Buddha's Eightfold Path, Samyak Drishti is the first step, So here, I think that it's significant that Shama precedes Dhamma. And this is the insight that this classical Advaita tradition is getting at here. This is what I think what they're saying, because this is actually explicitly discussed by Anandagiri, this follower of Shankara. What he says is, you cannot fully control the senses until you have brought your mind under control. That's the link between these two terms, Vidhyatma and Indriyahi, which are Atma Vashyahi. Until you have full control of, or not even full control, until you have to some extent controlled the mind, you cannot possibly control the senses. It's just like a dog. If there's like a piece of raw meat, the moment that meat appears, what's going to happen? His head's going to flick this way, his tongue's going to come lolling out. It's automatic. Because the dog has no control. It's a creature of impulse. So until you've controlled the mind, you cannot control the senses. Hence, Vidhyatma, the person who has his or her senses under control, the person whose senses are under the control of the mind, only that person can, that person alone can do that, who is Vidhyatma, who has control over his or her own mind. We can also link it to the Kathopanishad. There's this famous chariot metaphor, right? And the mind is likened to the reins of the chariot, and the buddhi is the charioteer, right? And so you have to first have full grip over the reins in order to control the horses, which represent the indriyas, the senses. So there's a kind of a chain here. First, you have to have some control over the mind in order to then control the senses properly. That's why Shama precedes Dhamma. But again, let's not be too mechanical about these things or too rigid and think that I have to master Shama before I get to Dhamma. It's not like that. There's also a feedback loop. Again, computer science. So the stronger the Shama becomes, the better you're at Dhamma. The better you are at Dhamma, restraint of senses, the more you gain in control of mind, self-control. So it's a kind of virtuous circle in that sense, is that they're both, Shama and Dhamma are also mutually reinforcing. But to get off the ground with sense control, you have to have some control over the mind. This seems to be the basic idea. Any questions about that? I thought this is a very useful insight into this Vidhyatma and Atma Vashyahi Indriyahi. So the classical Advaita tradition takes Atma to mean mind in both these phrases, and they explain the link between these two phrases in this very nice way, that Shama has to precede Dhamma. Another thing, I promised that we'd get to Sridhara's fourth and final, that fourth part of Arjuna's question. What was the fourth part? How does the illumined person, the Sthita Prajna, walk? Sthita Prajna saka bhasha samadhistasya keshava sthitadihi kim prabhasheta kim asita vrajeta kim vrajeta. How does that person walk? The illumined person walk? Sridhara says, charan. At the end of the first line of 64, Indriyahi charan, ranging over. That's what Sri Aurobindo is interpreting it, I think, in a more natural way, which is it's the senses ranging over the sense objects, not a literal walking. but Sridhara, he takes it to mean that this is Bhagavan Krishna's answer to Arjuna's, the fourth part of Arjuna's question, how does the Sthita Prajna, how does an illumined soul walk? Again, I think that there's a more, or this is something I haven't said before, and I'm kind of picking on Sridhara, but maybe unfairly. There's a more charitable way of interpreting Sridhara's interpretation, I think. The more charitable way would be along these lines, that he's saying that Bhagavan Krishna, because he's God, he's omniscient and he's, genius, super genius, he was able to answer Arjuna's question in a very clever way, while at the same time transforming it. So he's saying, oh, you want to know how the illumined person walks, talks, sit? I'll tell you how. He walks in the sense of his senses walking over, ranging over the sense objects. He talks how? By, and Shrida, we talked about that last time, but it was shloka 57, by not praising anybody, or not being influenced by praise and not criticizing anybody, by not saying anything bad or unspiritual or unwholesome, and so on and so forth. That is, it doesn't have to be that Sridhara is interpreting it in a very crudely literal way, and that he's misunderstanding the spiritual import of Bhagavan Krishna's answer to Arjuna. We can actually see it as complementing the other commentators' more spiritual interpretations. I wanted to mention that, but it's more fun to read it this. It's so funny to. Okay, any questions before we move to, or it's 7:21? Yeah, we can do one more. So this prasadis. But any questions first? No. So let's read the next one. '65. Prasade sarvadukhanam hani, or actually hanihi. Yeah, hanihi. It's a visarga because of sandhi becomes hanir. Okay, so hanir asya upajayate prasanna chetasaha hi ashu buddhihi paryavatishthate. Okay, so now please go to the second line of the same anvaya. Prasade, this is called Sati Saptami in Sanskrit. So when one has attained tranquility, asya, that person, which person? The Vidhyatma, that self-controlled person who has full control over the mind, who even while seeing sense objects is not carried away by them, in fact has absolutely no attraction or aversion toward them at all. That person. What happens? Sarva dukkhanam hanihi upajayate. Total eradication of all sorrows. What a wonderful state. Prasanna chetasaha buddhihi. So prasanna cheta, and that person who, for that person whose chetasaha, whose mind is prasanna, fully tranquil, even, calm, cool. Buddhihi ashu paryavatishtate. Ashu here means soon, quickly. Indeed, he means indeed, paryavatishtate. The intelligence, the buddhi of that person with a tranquil mind becomes very quickly settled, established. This person is a sthita prajna. Again, this word sthita prajna comes up, but here it's just a different way of saying the same thing. Sri Aurobindo says the intelligence of such a man is rapidly established. Okay. Now, the only thing I wanted to mention here is, actually, this is going back briefly to the word prasadam in the previous shloka. Prasadam adhigacchati, translated as tranquility, peace, something like that. I think that it's significant that they're using this word. This is actually, when I first read the Gita, when I was 19, this is one of these words, prasadam, shanti, these are what appealed to me, because it was before I'd become a monk, and I was missing something, not that you have any number of objects of enjoyment, it's not that, but you're missing that peace, that contentment, which is a true source of happiness. So I think that's really what prasadam means. It's a tranquility based on desirelessness. You can only really be tranquil and calm and peaceful if you don't have desires. Because the moment you have a desire, you're missing something. And you won't feel complete. You won't feel whole until you get that object of desire. So the only true peace, the only true tranquility is when you're completely free from desires. Right? Most of us have at least some desires, but there are degrees. And you'll find that the fewer the desires, the happier you are and the more peaceful you are. This is the This is a universal law, which almost nobody likes to acknowledge. And they have to learn the hard way over the course of many, 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 many lifetimes. Not even just one lifetime. In one life, you learn a lot if you're open to learning. But often not enough. And it takes us many, many lifetimes to learn this very, very important lesson. I'm reminded again of this beautiful verse from Vairagya Shatakam by Bhartrihari. Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala manasi cha paritushte kotafan ko daridraha. That person is poor, not who has $5 in her bank account. Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala, whose desires are vast, great, intense. Manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. When the mind is contented, paritushta, who is rich and who is poor? It's a beautiful verse. But I think this word prasadam is really packed with meaning. And it comes up again and again in different forms. This idea of tranquility, the tranquility that comes from being completely desireless. The wife of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother Sharada Devi, she used to say, when people would come to her and say, what should we pray for? You're always saying we should pray to God. What should we pray for? She says, you pray for desirelessness. It's the ultimate prayer. Because if you get that, you get everything. That's the one thing that's holding us back from spiritual enlightenment, is desires. Okay, so it's pretty heavy, but we covered a lot of ground. Any remaining questions before we do a brief meditation session? Yes.
The meaning of the whole shloka.
The meaning of the whole shloka. You mean 65? Okay. Oh, did I not do the Anvaya yet? Oh, well, I did, but okay. And do you mean in the context of the previous shlokas, or just in general, or do you have a particular?
Just, you have to say it in English.
Right, sort of a paraphrase. So that person who has attained tranquility, that person will no longer have any sorrows. That's the first line of 65, right? Sarva dukkhanam hanihi upajayate. Prasanna chetasa hi ashu buddhi paryavatishtate. And the buddhi of that person becomes firmly established. There's no possibility of wavering anymore, any kind of doubts anymore, any possibility of even losing his or her discrimination. Because that person has realized God.
This prasanna chetasa.
This chetasa is the sixth shashti vibhakti. It's in the sixth sense, or the sixth case. And the chetasa would be mind. I mean, in some form of mind, and prasanna will mean tranquil, right? So that person with a tranquil mind, that person's buddhi becomes firmly established. No more wavering. In the way that was just described in the previous shlokas. Buddhi nashaha, sammoha. That's not, this person who has attained unshakable tranquility, that person is beyond all these kinds of things. And this, we can also link it back to 59. Vishaya vinivattante niraharasya dehna rasavajjam rasopyasya param dristvani vatate. As spiritual aspirants, so long as we have not attained the highest spiritual goal, we may be very good at self-control, at avoiding sense indulgences, everything. But we cannot fully conquer desire, which is the word rasa here, means that desire for sense objects. That doesn't get eliminated completely until you realize the Supreme. Param dristvani vatate. That rasa goes only after you attain God realization or self-realization. And I think that's what's being talked about here. And in fact, that's what Sri Aurobindo, that's how he takes this. Oh, it's good that you mentioned this, because let's read Sri Aurobindo's commentary on this, which I think is quite insightful. What the problem is, it starts in medias res. So I'll read the first couple of sentences from the book, and then it continues in the apps version. Sri Aurobindo asks, but how is this desireless contact with objects, this unsensuous use of the senses possible? Almost paradoxical. This unsensuous use of the senses possible. Because it seems like it's, the Gita has been telling us again and again, like a tortoise, you should withdraw your You're just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs when something is attacking, you should withdraw the sense organs from sense objects. Now, suddenly, Bhagavan Krishna is saying, you're confronted with all these objects. You're happy looking at all these sense objects, but you're completely unaffected by them. So what is he saying exactly? How is this desireless contact with objects, this unsensuous use of the senses possible? It is possible, param drishtva. So he's also linking it to shloka 59. By the vision of the Supreme, param, the soul, the purusha, the atman, the eternal soul, and by living in the yoga, in union or oneness of the whole subjective being with that through the yoga of the intelligence. And then the app commentary starts. Then, free from reactions, the senses will be delivered from the affections of liking and disliking, escape the duality of positive and negative desire, and calm, peace, clearness, happy tranquility, atma prasada will settle upon the man. That clear tranquility is the source of the soul's felicity. Felicity means happiness. All grief begins to lose its power of touching the tranquil soul. That's that sarvadukhanam hanihi upajayate. The intelligence is rapidly established in the peace of the self. Here, as you get this buddhi paryavatishtate. Suffering is destroyed. Again, sarvadukhanam hani. It is this calm, desireless, griefless fixity of the buddhi in self-poise and self-knowledge, to which the Gita gives the name of samadhi. This is also, this last sentence is very important. We talked about this when we were in the fishbowl a few weeks ago. Were you there also? Yeah. What does samadhi mean? Because the word samadhi is used, samadhi stasya keshava. What does it mean that the sthita prajna is grounded in samadhi? Is this that state of trance that where you lose sight, you lose all external consciousness? No. According to Sri Aurobindo, at least, this is a kind of sahaja samadhi, where it's a natural samadhi where you could be interacting with other people in the world, doing day-to-day tasks, cutting vegetables, but you can still be in a state of samadhi, which means you're fully rooted in God, completely unaffected by sense objects or by desires. So does that help? Yeah, thank you for reminding me, because I wanted to read Sri Aurobindo's commentary and I'd forgotten. Good. Now we'll do a brief meditation. I like changing it up once in a while. So today we'll do breath mindfulness, mindfulness of breath, Buddhistic meditation. Gently close your eyes. Inhale slowly. And exhale slowly. When you inhale, just observe the breath. Focus your attention at the tip of the nostrils, where the breath enters as you inhale and as you exhale. Be mindful of the breath as you inhale and as you exhale. You find yourself getting distracted, gently bring the mind back to the breath. Gently open your eyes. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat.